quite a strong sense of racial nationalism, or perhaps grounded back again towards a more liberal democracy founded on constitutional values. And we'll explore some of the tensions at stake in reaching that scenario. Largely, I'll just be speaking to you, but I do have some visual aids, I think, which will help, visualize some of the data a bit better, because I also do want to look at some of the numbers that ground this particular debate. So if we think about, what happened in 1994, it was largely a political compromise between various racial groups, and especially resulting in the constitution, which has become the buttress of the modern political environment in South Africa as we stand today. But of course, part of the current tension is the realization that perhaps with political freedoms, which 1994 accorded in South Africa when the franchise was extended to all racial groups, is that the feeling right now is that that hasn't been coupled with economic emancipation. So the political freedoms have not translated necessarily into an environment or country in which the majority of the population feels included in the economy and are able to become productive members of the economy. In some sense, that analysis is true and not true. In the one sense, which I present here in this first slide, is really looking at how lives have improved, in fact, since 1994 through a wide range of indicators that we see here. So the most fundamental one is that, of course, the number of jobs have vastly increased from 1994 and 2016. About 15.7 million people in South Africa are currently in employment. If you even look at other indicators in terms of human progress, we can see that the numbers of malnourished children as a ratio of the young population has also decreased, right down to even other concerns such as crime and the murder rates, etc. But what's important to understand about the progress that has been made, and we love to often tell this good story about the progress that has been achieved since 1994, is that very much a great deal of it has occurred through social transfers or direct transfers between government to people. It hasn't been an investment into the human capital so that results in people eventually, in fact, being able to be dependent on themselves apart from the government or apart from the state. So it's quite an important realization, is that yes, there has been this vast improvement, but it's largely been off the back of really a ballooning public expenditure wage bill and direct transfers of housing, electricity, etc., which of course do make people's lives better, but they don't necessarily result in a population that is able to take care of themselves, take care of their families. And we can see that really throughout all of these indicators, there's been really a vast range of improvement. But I do want to move into now the picture of, it's further exemplified here as well, which I think perhaps maybe shows the picture a little bit better graphically, especially if you look at the number of informal houses, the number of formal houses. The blue bar, perhaps for those at the back, if you can't quite see the years, indicating 1996, so just 2 years after the formal sort of democratic dispensation, access to piped water as well, etc. So along all of these indicators, really, so access to piped water being here, you can see in 2016 a vast improvement, access to electricity. But again, these are the direct state transfers that I was referring to. What I do want to look at a bit more strongly, as we'll see later on, is really the investment in human capital and how much that forms part of the current picture that we're witnessing today. So what's quite worrying economically is this particular trend that we're starting to see here. So if we see sort of historically, we're looking at GDP growth globally, and we overlay that, that's South Africa's GDP growth with global GDP growth. The main takeaway here, I don't want to spend too much time on it, is just the fact that South Africa's tended to benefit from, global, the global economy. So when there's an uptick in the global economy, we found that South Africa's been able to, also grow on the back of that, etc. And the trend line between the global GDP growth and South Africa's GDP growth tend to move quite in tandem with one another. However, what we have witnessed, which is a different trend that's been happening from around, this period here, from around 2013, 2012, so a bit post the financial crisis, is there's been a strong decoupling of South Africa's economic growth trajectory instead of the global trajectory. So whilst the rest of the world we've seen quite moderate improvements post the financial crisis and a general global recovery, we're not witnessing the same in South Africa. In fact, GDP growth levels have started to decline. This graph here on the right-hand side, I think perhaps shows that last end part of that chart a bit more dramatically to witness what has happened from 2012 onwards to where we are at present.
Now, is that the South Africa growth rate?
Yes, so the solid red line,
Right.
compared with global GDP growth. Just to illustrate that decoupling that I was talking about. And then, of course, the concern there is that as GDP growth levels decline, consumer confidence declines, and ultimately household expenditure declines as well. And that's definitely the trend that we're seeing. What's particularly concerning about where we're at right now is that it's pretty close to actually crisis levels, whereas the rest of the global economy and many other emerging economies have started to improve, or at least look much better than the present scenario in South Africa. So without a global necessarily economic crisis, and with other emerging economies, upper and middle income countries on the same level as South Africa, showing growth rates well above 5% in some regions, we see South Africa at this level here, which is pretty much mimicking the crisis period, which is quite concerning because that, of course, is not what the external economic environment at present reflects. Most concerning, however, is that, besides the concern of sporadic periods of, recessionary environment, as we had in the first quarter of this year, is a concern that whilst there may be pickups in economic growth, the real concern is that actually in per capita terms, household incomes have been declining. So even when we have had periods of growth, which we have in the last few years, in fact, the population growth has eroded the economic growth that has taken place. So that really is the concern, and also helps you really understand what's happening is that on a per capita, an individual basis, South Africans are feeling poorer. And of course, this matches quite strongly with what we've seen. There's a bit of a lag in this chart, so perhaps in some ways it doesn't, as strongly illustrate the picture. But there's quite a strong correlation between household incomes and the level of protest level and instability. Again, you can question that because protest level instability is not measured directly, but it is taken from police reports which measure, crowd violence and crowd disturbances, which typically are related to protest level, to service delivery level protests. So what we see there is that essentially quite a strong impetus is to improve household incomes in order to improve the scenario around political and racial stabilities, particularly in the country. And this economic scenario that we see at present underpins what is happening in terms of the political rhetoric and the political narrative. In the absence of strong political will towards policy reform, we have seen an increased rise in political rhetoric that, drives or further widens the gap between rich and poor. And of course, the face of wealth and poverty in South Africa correlates quite strongly with race. And so it becomes really a race war, ultimately, is the concern between rich and poor, between black and white, if the policy reforms are not undertaken. So really we find that, in this environment, what really underpins the expectations, the confidence level, etc., is what's happening in the labor market. And we can see, again, mirroring what I said earlier about improved service delivery levels, in the same way, the employment story is also not quite so simplistic, because employment actually has grown, as we showed in the earlier slide. The number of people who are in employment has increased. However, the number of people who are unemployed has increased as well. So the orange bar is showing those who are unemployed, whilst the blue is showing those who are, those who are unemployed, whilst the blue is showing those who are in employment. So there's been an increase in both those who are employed and those who are unemployed. But the more poignant statistic is that at present, the number of South Africans who are on social welfare, are on social grants, outstrips the number of people who are in employment. So whilst those in employment may grow, what's really concerning is that there's an increasing number of unemployed dependent on the employed to obviously ensure those same social transfers that we were talking about, electricity, service delivery in terms of housing, etc. And ultimately, that labor absorption story is underpinned by the performance in schools and the South African education system. So just briefly to illustrate that here, what you're looking at is, now it's where we get more into, there's a more racial breakdown of these statistics, which I think is quite useful in understanding the narrative as well, is that broken down by racial groups, and these are South African classifications of racial groups, so black South Africans, coloured, Indian, white. And these are all together. The blue bar showing the matric pass rate of those people who get to matric and write the exam. So matric is the final year in South Africa. So after 12 years of schooling, to be your last or almost exit point before you enter university or college, etc. So what we see there is in blue, those who actually get to matric and write the exam, the percentages that pass. And then in orange is mathematics, the same story, those who write mathematics in matric and those that pass. And we can obviously see that there's quite a disparity between the different racial groups. Black South Africans, of course, well under 75%, and near 100% of white South Africans who in fact reach that level and pass matric. So essentially, we feel this really underpins the transformational racial redress story in South Africa, is that you cannot have economic improvements or economic empowerment of the broad-based population if the human capital pipeline of the future is being eroded in the way that we see here. Perhaps more dramatically even than these figures are the fact that in terms of even of enrollment in schools, there's a sheer drop between those who enter the school system and those that exit. So again, this is just showing those people who in fact make it to matric and pass. The scariest story, of course, is if you look at the fact that on an annual basis, you have on average for the last 10 years, about 1 million students entering the grade 1 level. A particular study that was conducted between 2002 and 2014 illustrates the story quite well. Is that, 1 million learners enter the schooling process in 2002. 12 years later, when you expect that same cohort to now be exiting the primary school level, less than 500,000 students exit. So that's that's obviously a decline of 500,000 or 50% of that cohort that never reaches or takes much longer to reach that exit point in in the basic education level. So of course that's the concern. One is the bleed in the basic education level, those who will continue to enter the labor market unprepared for the workforce. And then on the secondary level, those who may exit the schooling system, but really who don't pass or achieve unsatisfactory grades to enable them to continue with their education. This issue as well just shows a bit more dramatically the differences in mathematics pass rates between the years. So from 2008 until 2015, you see those numbers strongly declining. So I'd like to get to a discussion of course, we've seen these disparities and we've seen the disparities in the economic situation, but how then does that translate to, in fact, the racial lobbying that we've seen? So quite interestingly enough in South Africa, I think the more we get down to the data, the more perhaps the polling on the ground tends to differ and challenge the political narrative. So of course it suits certain political narratives for the argument to be that really it's not policy failure that's behind the kind of results that we're seeing, but rather a continued recalcitrance or lack of political will on the parts of those who own business, those who are wealthy and elite, typically translated to white South Africans, to engender the kind of changes and reform that would bring about mass-based prosperity. And those conversations and that rhetoric that is peddled in the media and amongst the governing party most particularly, then does begin to infiltrate and impact the narrative on the ground. So actually, when we poll people, when we poll individuals on a variety of issues, including on their feelings on race relations and affirmative action policies, etc., the results tend to be quite favorable. But over the years, we have seen a decline in that and an increasing spread between black and white and their views on various issues. So for example, if we look here, that's tracking when we've polled South Africans on race, asking them, have race relations improved or stayed the same? And we can see here that really quite closely the orange dot reflecting white South Africans, the blue dot or the black dot, if that's how it looks from afar, reflecting black South Africans. So really quite of common mind. Again, another popular question asked is whether or not jobs and education, what are the best ways to push South Africa forward or to create a better future, in which it's an open-ended question. Also, there's a question where some examples or options are provided. And overwhelmingly, people often choose the jobs and education are a better way, better alternative or best policies that we push need to create jobs and to improve the education outlook in South Africa, as opposed to increase redistributionary policies or policies around affirmative action, etc., which I will get into a little bit after this slide as well. Another question that's asked is whether sports teams should be selected on the basis of merit. This is really testing people's thinking around whether or not race-based or other socioeconomic indicator-based forms of redress are what might be preferred at a public and individual level, as opposed to the level of political rhetoric or what the politicians might espouse. And again, well, this is a question where there's a bit of divergence, but on the whole of it, for black and white South Africans, the majority selected that sports teams should be selected on the basis of merit alone. Whether your child should be taught by someone of your own race, again, very few polled to believe that, and this is also a good indicator of racial tensions or racial beliefs, the extent to which people would like their own children to be taught by somebody of a different race. Whether different races need each other for progress. Overwhelmingly a majority as well indicated that to be the case. And then also there was a question whether white South Africans must take second place in the country and whether they agree with that. And very few were polled to agree with that sentiment. However, when we translate this data back to the political rhetoric, it almost paints pictures of two different countries, because, of course, at the political level, race-based redress, despite the polling, continues to drive a message that suggests that, redress needs to be based on racial lines. So one clear case of this is affirmative action policies in South Africa, where they've been applied across the board around a variety of areas. So in the university space, but not only at universities, but also at an economic level in determining procurement deals and contracts, etc. Now, of course, as the Centre for Risk Analysis or the IR Institute of Race Relations, we are strongly in favour of redress measures, except that our current thinking is that redress has to be based on socioeconomic indicators as opposed to race as a proxy, due to the quite now well-documented empirical evidence that exists around the use of race as really to further political patronage for a few, and usually a politically connected few. And that's really has been the case in South Africa in much in the same way that it's been the case in other countries, in Malaysia and Sri Lanka, almost any country that has implemented any form of affirmative action policies, that same trend for it to not actually result in any kind of broad-based transformation in the broader population, but really to continue to be a form of transfers of wealth from the state to the politically connected elite. And so it's for that reason that, part of the measures of moving away from race in terms of the discussion around how to implement redress is to really figure out socioeconomic indicators, for which in any case many have argued race serves as a strong proxy for. So, of course, that's the argument that's usually been used at universities and even at the economic level, is that race continues to be a strong proxy for disadvantage. However, the current work that we're doing and the book that I'm currently writing and working on with some statisticians is to, of course, now embed the theory with actually the empirical evidence. So the theory exists around socioeconomic indicators predicting race, but there aren't actually credible economic indicators yet that do that. And so an important part, I feel, of moving towards a post-racial society would be to actually be able to base policy on socioeconomic indicators. So I think the university space is quite a nice, example in order to base it off from, in order to concretize this idea. But the idea would be that, of course, you want to give recognition to people who come from particular backgrounds, who might be first-generation students, who come from low-income households, etc., who come from low quintile schools that may not have enabled the kind of education to equip them properly to succeed at university. But all of those socioeconomic indicators then become masked when you use race, in fact, as the measure for redress, because then what you start measuring are the numbers of students who are black at a particular university, or the number of black owners in a company, and you've actually forgotten about the drivers of disadvantage, which actually were, to what extent in South Africa can people who come from a low quintile school, a low economic household, still thrive in society? And you have not answered those questions by necessarily adding black faces in companies, in schools, etc. So what this does is it creates almost an artificial supply that's not really there. And with that artificial supplies, obviously the problems that come with it is that we've often found, high dropout rates among students in university who've been inadequately prepared, companies that are unable to deliver on state contracts or services because they were selected partly on the basis of their racial profile. Whereas, in fact, if the underlying cause of disadvantage were looked at, we're much more better able to devise policy that tackles those socioeconomic criteria and therefore gets really down to the root of disadvantage at a much broader and mass-based level that benefits millions of South Africans or millions in the population, as opposed to only really the politically connected few or a small number of people who are then able to access, who are still able to access those particular measures, despite the absence of real assistance that targets their needs. Another area, obviously, where this has been quite important, where it has policy implications, is not just typically in the university space or even at the level of state preferential procurement deals, but I think what has become quite topical internationally as well is that conversation of ensuring diversity. So there's almost a dual purpose towards the racial conversation. Is on the one hand, obviously in redress terms, which we believe can be targeted by adding socioeconomic indicators that best speak to the causes and drivers of disadvantage. But on one level, it's not really about redress at all, but part of the race conversation has to do with the diversity that supposedly different racial groups bring. And this is the same with gender diversity in the workplace, etc. And so I feel that the same analysis or discussions around race has broader implications for diversity policies outside of the political space necessarily. And why this is important is that, of course, I think on a biological level, much of the conversations around race have become moot because there's quite a large degree of, I think, consensus in that particular field. But I think there's still a lot more to be done in the humanities around racial identity and the consequences of that in terms of how we think about diversity in the workplace. So a good example is that, hiring increased numbers of minority groups. Well, in South Africa, there would likely not be minority groups, but if you're hiring more Black South Africans or more Asians, etc., that might bring diversity to your workplace. We've often challenged this view by saying this then engages in a biological determinism. So if you assume that bringing in Black South Africans into the workplace increases diversity, that necessarily assumes that there's a particular set of beliefs or values or principles that hiring a Black person brings, that hiring a white person or person of a different race would not bring. And of course, it's quite problematic to deal with people from different racial groups as merely facsimiles or proxies for their broader racial group. And so really, in the workplace as well, what this translates to is identifying the areas of diversity that you wish to bring into the workplace. So be that, wanting to introduce people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, so for example, bringing people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, etc. Talking to the different indicators that I've just highlighted before. So whether you want to infuse your workplace with people that come from different schools, etc. So different quintile schools. I'm not sure if in the US it may be in the same quintiles, but in South Africa, schools are broken down into different areas of advantage, etc. Depending on the school location, the kind of house, incomes of the students from that particular school. So similarly in the workplace, some workplaces, especially in South Africa, have found that the employee cohort tends to come from a particular feeder schools or feeder universities, etc. So it may be that the type of diversity you would like to introduce into your workplace is to introduce people that come from different, whether it's universities or schools, etc. Another type of diversity might be saying that, to bring in empathy, etc. Where you feel that the workplace is not a welcoming place for people of certain backgrounds. But whatever those backgrounds are, we feel they're much more accurately and better defined by using the socioeconomic criteria as opposed to race. They definitely reveal much more about people and their backgrounds as opposed to merely using their racial profiles. Because especially of the strong correlation we found between people of the same racial backgrounds people of the same economic backgrounds, but who come actually from different racial groups. So in fact, you may think you're bringing in diversity into the workplace by hiring people from the same racial group. But if they tend to come from the same areas, the same urban areas, the same schools, etc., the level of diversity you actually bring in is far more compromised. I do want to leave time, I suppose, for questions. So what I do want to move on quickly is how this translates to the political space, because of course we've highlighted the historical background of how South Africa has got to where it is today in terms of the economic challenges and why that has turned itself into a racial debate because of the way in which socioeconomic status in South Africa tends to have a racial face and a racial profile, and how for that results or translates into racial tensions, and also how therefore the importance of race then begins to determine policy, for example, in terms of affirmative action policies and estate procurement deals, etc. But having highlighted the problems and the ways in which race thinking manifests itself into policy, how is it that South Africans are not particularly talking about perhaps a political alternative? Why is it that there's still talk necessarily of one political party? And this, is, again, is an area that strongly reflects the racial divisions. By and large, it is felt that the largest opposition in South Africa still lacks the political support because it lacks a strong black voter base. So again, it's not just in terms of policy implementation, but again in terms of how we design political campaigns and how we poll voters that I think would be quite important to reimagine, obviously, the racial narrative or the racial debate. And just to give you a little picture here of what I'm talking about, is that if you look at non-voters in South Africa from 1994 to 2014, they've really increased. And really, these are the voters that can swing the election either way in 2019 when we head into the national election. And a big part of what the undecided voters decide to do will ultimately determine South Africa's future. But it is felt that a strong hindrance to those swing voters switching to an alternative or opposition party is still based off the fact that South African politics is very much along racial lines. So will the DA, which is the largest, the Democratic Alliance, which is the largest opposition party in South Africa, be able to woo black voters? Again, this is the question that needs to be unpacked, and it's for that reason that further exploration of the factors that race acts as a proxy for is useful to identify. We don't believe it does help political parties to target a particular racial group. You cannot design policy or a political message around race or around, attracting black voters. You can, however, design a political message around, spatial planning and how to get people outside of urban areas closer to areas of work. You can design policy around how to improve the education system so that greater numbers of those who enter education exit at the end. You are able to design policies around why small businesses are failing and unable to get contracts. So the face of all of those challenges in South Africa at present may be black. So it may be true to say that those who are not exiting the schooling system tend to be black. Those who are far from areas of work and need spatial, redress policies do tend to be black. Those who are struggling to start up businesses, etc., may be black. And so then the simplistic sort of political message then becomes we need to design or we need to speak to the black voter or design policies that speak to the black vote. However, that masks actually the myriad of underlying socioeconomic challenges and problems that exist. And so we think it's quite important to move away from the race-based dialogue to actually a dialogue that addresses the root causes of disadvantage and the root drivers of disadvantage in the country. So this is just a reflection of the bars were the undecided voters, but this is now just a reflection of the voting numbers. So we can see how in the blue line, the African National Congress's votes have declined over the years, while simultaneously those of the DA, which is that orange line, have been on the increase. And these are the other opposition parties. So effectively what has happened is that South Africa's largest opposition has mostly taken votes from other opposition parties, but there's actually been very little change in terms of voting patterns between the Liberation party, which was the African National Congress, and the largest opposition, which is the DA. And that major shift in political voting patterns that still needs to occur in South Africa is largely the message is still based around the transferring of a racial vote. However, I suppose the contradictory message that we're espousing is that it's actually not the transference of a racial vote, that race-based message is actually a lazy proxy for a more complex set of socioeconomic indicators. So there's actually people that fit into different socioeconomic profiles that are failing to be moved into voting or to voting for an opposition party. And those key socioeconomic profiles need to be better understood in order to design policies and a political message that speaks to them as opposed to speaking to their race. I mean, the consequences of this, I think, are quite profound, not just for South Africa, but for the world at large. Obviously, in slightly more, political terms, it means that how we shape the idea of nationhood is then not based on, these ethnic or biological sets of factors where there's actually no common set of beliefs, but rather it can be based on an idea of nationhood that's based on a shared set of political values or principles that are, broadly speaking, universal in nature. So part of the challenges to racial identity that still need to be had is, as I've explained before, not the sense of necessarily a biological argument, because as I think the conversations there are, although there are still conversations on the fringes, I think are largely moot. The conversations that still need to happen are in the humanities around ideas of, group theory and what constitutes the group, and to what extent racial groups can be identified as groups per se. And that conversation rests on the fact that, by and large, there actually are no grounding or cohesive belief systems, values, etc., among racial groups. There may be binding and consistent belief systems among people of different, traditional groups in South Africa, and this may be reflected in other African societies as well, or outside of the African context. So there are groups based around shared ideas or beliefs, such as religion or political principles, etc. But race itself is actually not a binding belief, other than typically a coalition based on the idea of having been marginalized in a particular society. And the politics of marginalization, or the implications of mobilizing on the basis of being a marginalized group, have very poor effects on policy in terms of misdiagnosing the policy problems, and then also in terms of coming up with solutions that actually don't speak to the key drivers of disadvantage. Thank you. Cool. Thank you. I don't know if there are any questions.
Please identify yourself.
Yes?
Thanks. Hi, my name is Brian Levy. I'm on the faculty here.
Yes.
Cape Town.
Yes.
So, I want to discuss, I don't know what to call it exactly. We could call it unconscious white privilege. We could call
Right.
it the psychological dynamics that feed into race and ethnicity. And I wonder if you'd comment on the degree to which generations of inherited entitlement on the part of white South Africans translate into and we could translate part of this argument to the US too, but I'll stick with South Africa, translate into a way of being in the world that makes it particularly difficult for a historically white party. And I'm not just discussing this as coming from the way it gets positioned by the ANC, but by the way in which some of the white leadership in the DA, for example, is to position themselves. It's particularly difficult to win alliances, not just because of history, but because of a way of engaging in the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, this points to, and you're welcome to disagree with me on this fact, but where I feel that this leads to the kind of racial determinism that I was speaking of, was to assume that people of different racial groups approach the world differently, or that, there's a white way of engagement or a black way of engagement. This is not to deny that I believe groups exist. Groups definitely exist, and I don't, I could get into quite an in-depth philosophical discussion on that part, but I think there's some interesting work being done in philosophy around group theory and what constitutes a group. And this is part of the work that I'd like to bring in, is that actually racial groups lack many of the fundamental characteristics of group cohesion. So some basis of groups could be, a shared characteristic. So, for example, you could say everyone who has white hair, except actually even biologically, it's not consistent who is considered black in society, which is reflected by the difficulties the apartheid government faced, in fact, racially classifying people. So there's actually not even a common, physical or biological characteristic for race. It lacks a common characteristic in terms of beliefs. So there's not a single unity of purpose. You couldn't say all black South Africans or all black people believe in X in the same way that you might be able to say, at the very least, anyone who professes to be of the Christian faith believes that Jesus exists, or or that Christ existed. So there's that common belief there. So of course there'll be disagreements amongst Christians on the fringes, but there probably is one reducible factor that you could say Christianity is based on. It may not be the factor I've just mentioned. If people wish to disagree, maybe all Christians don't believe in Jesus, but it probably can be reduced to at least one single factor. So there needs to be either a commonality of a characteristic, a commonality of some kind of belief system, etc. And it's very difficult with racial groups to reduce it to something that combines or makes that group cohesive. I know there's ongoing work perhaps in the areas of Ubuntu, philosophy, etc. But even then, there's wide-ranging discussions and disagreements about what Ubuntu actually is or means in a very practical day-to-day level. So whilst I think that the Democratic Alliance is struggling to make traction amongst black voters, I would challenge the view that it's because it's largely a white party that fails to engage with black people in a black way, because I'm not sure anyone could define what perhaps black terms of engagement are or what white terms of engagement are. And I would further challenge the ability of people to cross-pollinate ideas and to learn from each other. So very much so that people who've attended certain schools and lived in certain areas begin to act and behave in certain ways. So in the same way that perhaps white South Africans, having lived in close proximity perhaps to black South Africans, might be very different from, white people in other places of the world that really interact with people of different ethnic and different language groups, etc. So I don't think that that's the reason. I don't think it's a difference necessarily in culture, because I don't think there is a different black culture per se. There could be different cultures within the different cultural groups, so Zulu, Xhosa, etc., but not as a common racially defining feature. I think the differences do lie perhaps in the aspirations that different people of different socioeconomic profiles have. So I do think that the Democratic Alliance probably has not fully spoken to people who live outside urban areas, has not fully understood their needs. It has not probably fully understood how to speak to people who wants a level of economic inclusion, etc. And I think it's consequential that in South Africa, all of those characteristics happen to closely coincide with race. So then it is easy to say, well, the problem is race. But actually the problem is a deeper set of other factors that need to be dealt with and engaged on a separate level that I think most political parties are not doing, not even the ANC. But I think the ANC gets away with not doing it because there is still that sentimental attachment with it being the party of liberation. But as that wears down, and as all political parties fail to speak to the voter base, I think this picture is going to continuously follow the same trend of a growing number of disaffected voters who neither feel that the ANC is their political home, but also don't feel that any of the opposition parties speak to their needs either. Yes. Oops, and then at the back.
Tony Carroll. I'm the one that got you here, and I'm an adjunct professor here. And thank you to your wonderful, comprehensive presentation, and say hello to Franz for me when you get back. I'd be really interested in looking at a cohort that's only defined by their socioeconomic characteristics, and rather than on a non-racial basis. I'd love to see a group of colors from Brackenfell, of poor whites from Benoni or Vryborg, and put them into a class not distinguished by race, and sort of test your hypotheses here about how they will variously do. But on the earlier chart, and the question that I have for you, at least more of a political nature, is the upswing of protest. You see this certainly at the university level. You see in the failure of municipal services and deliver social services in cities. And in the context of an increased, it seems, incidence of race baiting in the political environment in South Africa over the course of the next 17 or 18 months between now and the next election, do you think that there will be an increase in the political protests, and do you think it will become maybe more racially focused? Because Dudizani Zuma, just a couple weeks ago, made some fairly unveiled or very thinly veiled references to wanting to get, some of the big white monopoly capitalists sort of in their sights. So I'm just wondering whether this might be a scenario that you could see unfold over the next 17 or 18 months before the election.
Yeah. Before I answer your second question, I just wanted to add a little bit towards the first, is that, we're quite excited about the possibility of being able to, develop a set of socioeconomic profiles that would accurately predict race. So by that I mean, if you have a current survey where Black South Africans would respond a certain way, white South Africans would respond a certain way, what would be quite a find is to match those same racial groups with socioeconomic profiles. So you could call it socioeconomic profile 1, socioeconomic profile 2, and you'd have socioeconomic profile 1 accurately predict what a black person would predict, and socioeconomic profile 2 accurately predict what a white person would predict, because then that would help us to obviously then see the drivers of the responses between racial groups, and to obviously prove the hypothesis that it's not really race-driven. But even if we don't manage to do it, I think the theory of that is sound, and hopefully it's a challenge as well for those who are, professors in those particular fields to continue and engage in that field of research. It's an enormous database that we're working with. So I think it could, it will take years of consistent combing through all of that data. And it may seem, as well, I think, some challenge the point of engaging in such an intensive exercise when all you're going to do is predict results that already exist. But I think the benefit of it is to show that those same narratives or that same way of thinking can be predicted, but using indicators that have actually nothing to do with race. And hopefully that starts to lead us towards a post-racial future or post-racial society. But in terms of whether it's going to become far more racialized towards 2019 election, absolutely. I think the current narrative right now, ironically, is not, if you were to open a South African newspaper today, I think much of the conversation is not yet very race-based, because there's been a lot of corruption charges and an intense focus on corruption, these surface-level issues. But I think once the election fully gets underway, and the ANC, after their December elective conference at the end of this year, has chosen a front runner for their campaign, the attention again will then be switched to not just the ANC, but between the political parties, and why the ANC continues to be a better alternative. And that typically always devolves to the same answer, is that they're the only party that speaks to the black voter, without really translating the ways in which that is.
Hi, my name is Hansam Lee. I'm a first-year MA student here at SAIS. So, I think what you're saying obviously is very super interesting, and it definitely makes sense, the idea that within a single race you have a diversity in socioeconomic status, and that informs that person's decision to vote. For example, in America with Trump's election, people were shocked that black people or people of color in general were voting for Trump, but the reason why is because we also have diversity within our race groups in terms of income and religion and in general, things like that. But I was wondering if you had a chance to see Ta-Nehisi Coates' article in The Atlantic that he wrote recently called the first white president. I don't know if you've seen that.
No, and surprisingly not, because I actually read most of his articles. But
I think it's a really amazing article, but he kind
related, right?
Yeah, talks about how white Americans across every single socioeconomic status group, every group, and actually, in fact, white Americans, people who voted for Trump in general had a higher income bracket than the people who didn't vote for Trump. So what he's arguing there is that, yes, race, in fact, did play the most pivotal role in the elections, and it, in fact, was this kind of whitewashing of Barack Obama's legacy that kind of led to Trump's rise. And in that argument, you see that he is pushing against the current narrative that socioeconomic status at the white Rust Belt voters reacted against this kind of, you know, the new globalized economy, et cetera. And the question becomes, and what about, you know, Black working class people or, you know, other people of color who didn't go for droves to Trump? I mean, you mentioned that kind of that there is diversity, of course, that race and economic status play a role differently for different race groups. But I was wondering, I guess you didn't read it, so I was wondering what your thoughts were on that for the U.S., like the way that race could play a role, you know, in rallying support for one candidate.
I think, unfortunately, both sides lack, well, I think one side of this argument lacks empirical data. The other side lacks a sound theoretical foundation. So I think the argument I make is the theory of it makes sense because, quite simply, you don't think with your skin. So there has to be underlying factors that shapes the thinking that, you know, a certain cohort has. So why do Black people think the way they think? It has to be rooted on something deeper than, you know, than just somebody's skin color. And I'm saying we can try to map out those socioeconomic experiences to outline what a person who fits a particular socioeconomic profile is. And that today, that socioeconomic profile may fit a Black person, but as we carry into the future, that socioeconomic profile may fit someone else. But that someone who has this collection of views is likely to think and behave in a particular way. But that currently in our present situation, that aligns most closely with someone who happens to be, you know, a person of color or a Black person. So I think that's theoretical. I mean, and I'm happy to have people challenge that and to discuss that. I think that's how the arguments get stronger. But I think for me, that theoretical basis is a lot stronger than the reverse that has some kind of racial determinism, that by virtue of being Black or by virtue of being white, you have certain thoughts or beliefs or preferences just by virtue of your skin color alone. But fortunately enough, what that side has in terms of data or evidence, if you can call it that, is that, of course, it's simple to poll people on the basis of race, because one, you just ask them to, well, self-identify, and then you have an easy set of a survey that says, well, white people think this. But I think it actually masks the criteria that I'm talking about. So the data exists, but I would question the quality of that data, because theoretically, I'm convinced that, in fact, it is measuring something else that is not race. So I think the theoretical foundations of the race-based polling have to be improved, whereas the data and empirical evidence of the side that believes that it's socioeconomic driven, their data needs to be improved. So I think their theory is strong, but it lacks data, whereas the other side, the data is there, but I think the theoretical foundations of that argument are weak.
But doesn't that, like, isn't the premise that kind of that race doesn't, we know race is not like real, right? It's a social
Yes,
construction.
which I think is part of the theoretical argument that supports the other, the argument that I'm making.
If I could just comment here.
Sure, I don't know, I think also in some ways we can get into a discussion if you want to chip into what she's saying.
I'm interested in whether, Paul Lubeck, what you're arguing perhaps is what Theda Skocpol's argued on what kinds of government interventions are sustainable over time, and that she argues that ones that target very specific groups, perhaps identity politics, she thinks over the long run will not be successful because they create coalitions against them, against the privileging that occurs. And she looks at post-Civil War in the U.S. and veterans programs. No one touches them. They're very powerful. No one can eliminate them. Social Security, and we've just had a round now in America with health care, with the Republicans controlling all the institutions and are incapable of dismantling the previous universal expansion in health care. Is that underlying or have any relevance to what you're arguing on not focusing on race, but focusing on service needs and things like this?
Yes, of course. But I mean, I think the problems with race-based policies, as I've outlined in the speech, I think there's quite a number of them, not only in their tendency to create divisions and to, in fact, create this wedge in society, but even amongst the groups themselves, there's usually then there's usually then an internal interest group that determines on behalf of the rest of the group their thoughts and behaviors. So it's actually impossible to define individually a collective identity. Any interpretation of what that collective identity is will always be based on everyone's individual interpretation, which then points against the existence of any kind of collective unity in that particular identity. So yes, it creates internal divisions, not just the external intergroup relations, but I think even within those particular groups themselves. There's no consistency or coherence in belief and ideas. As I was pointing out earlier, in terms of that group theory, what constitutes a group, I cannot find that commonality and by which you could define what a black identity is, or any other group that you wish to define on a biological basis.
Can I build on Paul's comment a bit? I mean, in a way, the dilemma I'm hearing in this conversation is that there's an essentialist argument that's tied to race, and then there's an anti-essentialist argument that says, no, race doesn't. And it's the wrong terrain. The terrain that Paul is pointing to is, regardless of what we may or may not inherit from a generation or two or three, or however we want to define it, the challenge is the challenge of inclusion and the challenge of inclusive policies. And so I'm going to put an idea to you and see how you react to it, that if I take a party like the DA or South Africa's liberal institutions, and liberal in the South African context doesn't mean the same thing it means here. Liberal in the South African context means a bit more like libertarian individualist here. That part of the dilemma is the conversation you're having, or that one, has led to inadequate attention to what would genuinely inclusive economic and social policies look like. And that, in a sense, the debate on race versus merit then leads to those arguing the merit side of it to deeply neglect how do you address the incredible challenges of inequality and structural inequality in the society. And that, it's almost an encouragement, and I'm curious if you can give the state of how you see this discourse in the world you're inhabiting in South Africa, to say, let's take inclusion much more seriously than we have, rather than have the argument about essentialist versus non-essentialist views.
No, it's interesting to me you say that, because I think the argument I'm making is for a more pointed redress and more pointed inclusion of people, and saying that we do not include people if we merely view them as, proxies for a broader racial group. That the true way to drive inclusion is to, in fact, identify more accurately, more rigorously, the drivers of disadvantage, which are based on a number of those criteria that we've been talking about, whether it's educational background, whether it's language, going to an institution that speaks a different language to your home language. There can be an extended list of them. But the point is that addressing those areas of disadvantage is what will result in broad-based inclusion. At least that's our thinking. And that the fact that affirmative action policies, no matter which geographic area that we look at, and we've looked at Malaysia, Sri Lanka, and various others, where there's been some, of course, with the slight difference that in South Africa it happens to be the majority that you're trying to implement affirmative action policies for, as opposed to the minority. But in all of these areas, there's the same tendency that it doesn't result in mass inclusion. It always results in the benefiting of a particular and pointed, wealthier or more politically connected group. And the reason it does that is quite clear it's quite obvious. It's because it's based on a proxy that all people share, regardless of disadvantage or regardless of whether they're actually, in fact, excluded. So the fact that you're black will entitle you to entitlements that perhaps you shouldn't be receiving. That you can be black and be and come from, a wealthy background, not be a first-generation graduate, live in an urban area, etc. So it's quite possible to be black and not experience all of those sets of disadvantages. And when you don't and you benefit, the policy thinks that it's succeeding because black people are benefiting. But actually, the black people who share those socioeconomic disadvantages then don't benefit. So you continue to perpetuate just this middle class. And I think that's why, particularly in South Africa, the results of affirmative action or post-democratic policies were so exponentially successful in the beginning, because of course you're now giving access to people who were completely denied access from various positions in the labor market, etc. So I think the initial impact of an affirmative action policy is going to be quite profound, but it's going to end up with a certain lag, because at a certain point, it's actually not addressing the core drivers of disadvantage. And I think South Africa's at that stage now where the core drivers of disadvantage need to be identified and addressed, because there is already a large black middle class that has come out of the democratic dispensation. But if that same black middle class continues to benefit as gatekeepers or as proxy beneficiaries for the broader millions of black South Africans who still remain poor, then we're never going to bridge that divide. You just replace old elites, as the cliche goes, with the new elites.
I agree. So I'd love to see you, you won't have it now. But here's our 6-point strategy for addressing inclusion and disadvantage. I mean, that's where this takes one, to the content of what that actually means.
Yes, but then it would take us to a discussion of mapping out all of those areas and saying, this is how we address spatial inequality, not of some race-based land grabs, but perhaps social housing, bringing people closer to urban areas. This is how we address education. This is how we address, people who lack the transfer of maybe education or cultural capital. So if your parents weren't university graduates, how do we enable you to have the resources and support structure to still succeed through university? But it would definitely be tackled on a separate indicator level as opposed to a broad race-based level.
Hi, I'm Vemba Dizolele. I'm on the faculty here. Interesting presentation. How do you account, I mean, of course, within the case of South Africa, the parameters are slightly different from, let's say, the experience we have in the US and other places. But where do you put the role of the aggregate experience? So in the case of South Africa, you had apartheid. In the case of US, however ill-defined it is, we still talk about racism, right? So this is the notion that we're fighting with today, with the Take a Knee movement and stuff. So i.e., the experience of a black man within a certain country, of an ethnic minority or whatever it is, there's a lot of commonality in that, regardless of your race, regardless of the color, regardless of your class, that I mean. So in the US, for instance, you hear people say, look, I've been a chief of staff of the armed forces, but every time I go to the store, I'm still being followed. Or somebody say, I can be a faculty, I can be a senator, I'm still treated X amount of way by the police. So when we talk about diversity, there's this element that has nothing to do with class, but is that about that common experience that then affect the perspective that maybe, let's say, an African faculty may bring to the way he approaches the class, or the way he sees certain issues. And this manifests itself even in law enforcement, right, across the board. So there's an issue there. I don't know if you addressed it, if I missed it, but where do you account? Because there's this common experience that is beyond what you're saying in terms of class and experience or a smaller group determining.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm making sense.
No, you definitely are.
Thank you.
I think also, I mean, obviously this conversation is so varied, and I think where you're pointing it towards is where I would make the distinction between racism and the existence of racial identity. So even if we were all to disavow our racial identities and say that, being of a particular skin color doesn't have any particularly deterministic end, it wouldn't mean that people who are racist and still classify you, whether you like it or not, would not exist. So I think actually those for me are separate challenges. There are policy responses to dealing with racism, so the false perception that racial identities exist, as opposed to how you deal with racial identity in and of itself, and whether people self-identify as being part of a particular group, and whether we treat people of a particular group as though they, by virtue of being part of those groups, have particular responses. So I think what I've been dealing with mostly is the kind of racial deterministic thinking that perhaps arises out of racial classification. What I haven't dealt with so much is racism. So almost taking my argument as a given and saying, well, fine, we can accept that racial identities or race does not exist, but what do you do with people who, regardless of that fact, will still treat you as though race does exist and that race, is important? And I think the responses for that differ, and will differ in various contexts. I mean, one context that we've discussed throughout this conversation is perhaps in the workplace. And I know there's been developments there in terms of, blind interviewing, etc. I think definitely interventions can be done to bring awareness and to remove racism. And in fact, I think part of the awareness bringing, part of having people, tackling racism is actually in the debunking of race. I don't think we can tackle racism by buttressing racial identities. So in fact, the one feeds into the other. I don't know if you understand what I'm saying, that you still look a bit skeptical.
Yeah, but at the same time, historically, there's institutionalization of that, right? So institutions themselves, but it's in the case of
Sure.
I'm not living in South Africa, visiting it, I don't know if that has changed or not changed. In the US, in spite of the tremendous progress this country has made, but there's something that is called that. So I think the argument, and then I understand what you're saying, I mean, we can talk later, but to be interesting, not so just in terms of racism itself, but because part of the diversity, whether it's numbers, is there's some assumptions. You made a lot of the assumptions how this is determined. Maybe there's a powerful group within the group that said things. But then there is also in the side of the institutions that have been slow. So as long as institutions do not move and account for what you're saying, that also becomes a challenge. Yes. So how does the military recruit? How do lawyers look at cases of criminality? We cannot just be blind in that sense, right? Because for the reason you just mentioned that you agreed with me in terms of, even if we said, I just feel like a human being. I grew up in Congo. I've never considered myself being a black person until I went to Europe. That then my blackness became apparent to some other people. Or I came to the US, we have to check on every form
institutional exclusion is obviously a big problem as well, but I think the same way in which race functions as a poor proxy in society and the other sort of political and economic areas I've been talking about, I think in the same way within organizations and institutions, race sometimes is also a false proxy for other events that are occurring. So of course, we've recognized that there do exist legitimately people who are racist, who will look at you and engage in some kind of racial determinism in their head about who you are and what you think and what you believe in, just purely by looking at you. And there's certain responses we can have, to how to deal with people who have these racist inclinations. But another part in which ways often people misdiagnose racism is to actually identify other issues in the institution and the workplace that have got nothing to do with racial identity at all. So, for example, I used to work in financial services, and a large part of the problem in financial services is people often say, that it's also particularly in South Africa, racist. Usually, white South Africans are in that profession, or that even that it's sexist and it's not really a sector in which women typically do well. But some of what that is actually masking is, one, on the racial identity side, is actually people who have the same preferences, not because of their race, but rather because of their background. So there's a kind of cultural snobbishness, if you want to call it that, around perhaps which institution you went to. So you'll find that people that all went to the University of Cape Town, bandy or group together, or at least people who went to South Africa's own set of elite universities tend to get along at the exclusion of those who've went to maybe technical colleges, etc., and other institutions of learning. And that will mirror itself as racial exclusion, because typically white South Africans and those who are privileged have attended a particular set of universities or come from particular homes and backgrounds, and those who are black have not. And I think race will mask that distinction, and people will say it's a race issue, when in fact it's a similarity of solidarity around, sports teams or institutions, and having the same background in that sense. And similarly on the gender, and I think race and gender are very good, they operate in the same ways, where a lot of women felt excluded in financial services. And again, that had to sometimes do with, not that there aren't women who are interested in sports. I don't want to engage in my own kind of false determinism either. But at least for me, it was the case that where previously I felt quite alienated with traders on a trading floor at a bank, Once I actually took a mild interest in rugby and football, they loved me. I mean, we would sit there and talk about the rugby game on the weekend. We'd talk about the latest cricketing results because cricket is quite a popular sport. But the point is, I made some headway in reaching out to them and forming quite a good, close relationship with those colleagues by finding commonalities in sports that actually had nothing to do with gender. And it made me question, at a certain point, did feel as though the environment was quite sexist, but it made me challenge that thinking, that perhaps sexism is maybe a secondary, it presents itself as sexism, but actually the underlying causes are a lack of commonality and interests and other criteria. So I think whether it's the workplace or broadly speaking, in terms of designing policy, it is definitely worth doing a lot more rigorous exploration of socioeconomic factors that closely mirror themselves as race and society, that may in fact be quite separate, and where we can have more direct and pointed solutions for them.
We have to wind up, but I wanted to ask you to think about the future and how significant is a declining proportion of the whites in the overall demography and for bringing about the changes you're talking about, for identifications based on education or shared interests and things like that. Is that significant, and how long do you think it will be significant?
Are you referring to white Africans leaving the country?
Yeah, no, just low fertility rates and higher immigration rates have reduced the total number of whites over time.
Yes, I'm not quite sure I understand
The
where
question
the question part,
is this trend important, and how long can it continue? That's all.
Okay, so is the trend of basically less white South Africans important to examine or not?
Yeah.
Well, again, and maybe I don't want to sound, like a broken telephone, because I
Right.
think this argument really leads down to the same, core thesis, is that whilst we are seeing it in terms of like the brain drain and other, characteristics as perhaps an exodus of white South Africans from the country, I think increasingly that's probably more linked to that people who have a particular education qualification will start to seek prosperity outside of South Africa's borders, whether they be black or white, etc. That right now it's mostly white South Africans leaving the country, but I see no reason why, as more and more black South Africans become educated, if the kind of reforms that are necessary do not happen, that there will be a severe brain drain occurring across all the different racial groups.
Okay.
So I don't think it's significant as a racial factor. I don't think that white South Africans leaving the country is necessarily linked to a discomfort around, or at least all of them, around the political situation. You will here and there, I suppose, read of various groups and white genocide, etc. But I really think those are fringe groups, and that's definitely not the majority opinion. I think it really does center around levels of crime and economic potential in the country, which I think all citizens will experience.
Good. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you again.